In a time when Israel had no king and chaos reigned, one woman rose to change everything. While enemy chariots of iron crushed all hope and a ruthless commander terrorized the land for 20 years, God chose the most unlikely warrior. This isn't just another Bible story. This is about a prophetess who commanded armies, a coward who needed courage, and a nomadic woman who would drive a tent peg through tyranny itself. The stars fought from heaven. A river became a weapon, and a mother's weight turned into eternal mourning. Discover how Deborah shattered every expectation and why her song still echoes today. Death has a way of changing everything. When Ehud died, something shifted in Israel. The man who had brought them peace and freedom was gone, and with him went their memory of faithfulness. It's strange how quickly people forget. One generation experiences God's deliverance, and the next acts like it never happened. The book of Judges, chapter 4, verse 1 tells us exactly what happened. After Ehud died, the Israelites once again did evil in the eyes of the Lord. That simple sentence carries the weight of an entire nation's failure. They didn't stumble into evil accidentally. They didn't drift away slowly without noticing. They chose it. They looked at everything God had done for them, all the ways He had rescued them from their enemies, and they turned their backs on Him anyway. This wasn't the first time. Israel had a pattern, a cycle that repeated itself over and over. They would serve God for a while, then forget Him and worship idols. God would allow enemies to oppress them as discipline. They would cry out for help. God would send a deliverer. They would have peace for a generation. And then, as soon as that deliverer died, they would do it all over again. Round and round they went, like a wheel stuck in mud, never learning, never growing, always returning to the same mistakes. But why? Why would they abandon the God who had brought them out of Egypt, who had parted the Red Sea, who had given them the promised land? The answer is simpler than we might think. They forgot. When life got comfortable, when the battles were won and the harvests were good, they stopped telling the stories. They stopped teaching their children. They stopped remembering who they were and whose they were. And when you forget where you came from, you lose sight of where you're going. The evil they did wasn't just breaking a few rules. They embraced the worship of false gods, the Baals and Ashtoreths of the Canaanite people around them. These weren't just statues. These religions involved practices that degraded human dignity, that celebrated everything God's law protected against. Israel was supposed to be different, set apart, a light to the nations. Instead, they became just like everyone else, chasing after gods made of wood and stone that couldn't see, couldn't hear, couldn't save. And so the cycle began again. But this time, the oppression would be unlike anything they had experienced before. God doesn't ignore rebellion forever. He's patient, more patient than any of us deserve. But there comes a moment when love requires discipline, when a father sees his child running toward danger. Sometimes the most loving thing he can do is let them feel the consequences of their choices. That's exactly what God did with Israel. Judges chapter 4, verse 2 states, "So the Lord sold them into the hands of Jabin king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor." Notice that word, sold. It's a strong term, isn't it? God didn't just allow this to happen passively. He actively handed them over to their enemy. This was judgment, but it was also mercy in disguise, because sometimes we need to hit bottom before we're willing to look up. Jabin wasn't just any king. He ruled from Hazor, a powerful city in northern Canaan. Hazor had a history with Israel, and it wasn't a pleasant one. Generations earlier, During Joshua's conquest of the land, Hazor had been one of the great Canaanite strongholds. Joshua had defeated it and burned it to the ground. The king of Hazor back then had organized a massive coalition of armies to fight against Israel, and God had given Joshua victory over all of them. But now, years later, Hazor had risen again. The city had been rebuilt. A new king sat on the throne, bearing the same name as that ancient defeated king, Jabin. Whether this was actually the same royal line, or just a traditional title for Hazor's kings, the message was clear. What Israel's ancestors had conquered, their descendants had lost. The enemy they had defeated was now their master. This wasn't random. This wasn't bad luck or political misfortune. Judges makes it absolutely clear that God sold them into Jabin's hands because of their rebellion. When you reject God's protection, you leave yourself vulnerable to every enemy that wants to devour you. Israel had chosen to serve false gods, and now they would serve a false king. Jabin's power was extensive. He didn't just rule Hazor, he controlled a significant portion of Canaan. His influence spread across the northern territories where several Israelite tribes lived. The people who were supposed to possess the land as their inheritance were now subjects in their own homes. They paid tribute to Jabin. They obeyed his laws. They lived under his shadow, day after day, year after year. But Jabin himself wasn't the one Israel feared most. He had a commander, a military leader who would become the face of their oppression and the source of their terror. His name was Sisera. Some names carry weight. When mothers heard the name Sisera, they pulled their children closer. When farmers saw dust rising on the horizon, they wondered if his army was coming. When village elders gathered to discuss their problems, Sisera's name was spoken in whispers, as if saying it too loudly might summon him. The second part of Judges chapter 4, verse 2 introduces us to this man. Sisera, the commander of his army, was based in Harosheth Hagoyim. While Jabin held the throne in Hazor, Sisera controlled the military from Harosheth Hagoyim, a strategic location that gave him access to the major trade routes and valleys of northern Israel. He wasn't just a soldier, he was a tactical genius who understood how to use geography and technology to dominate an entire region. Sisera commanded respect through fear. His very presence on the battlefield could break the spirit of opposing forces. He had built a reputation as a commander who didn't lose, who crushed resistance before it could organize, who made examples of anyone who dared to defy Jabin's authority. Under his leadership, the Canaanite military machine became something Israel simply couldn't match. What made Sisera so dangerous wasn't just his tactical skill or his ruthlessness. It was what he commanded. It was the weapon that made his army virtually unstoppable. The technology that turned battles into massacres before they even began. Sisera had access to something that changed the entire balance of power in the region. The Israelites fought with bronze weapons, with bows and slings, with whatever they could forge or fashion. They had courage and they had numbers. But courage means nothing when you're facing an enemy with superior technology. Sisera had something that made conventional warfare impossible for Israel. He had the ancient world's equivalent of tanks. He had iron chariots. Imagine standing on a hillside with nothing but a bronze sword in your hand, watching the valley below fill with the sound of rolling thunder. Except it's not thunder, it's wheels. Hundreds and hundreds of wheels, attached to war machines that gleam in the sunlight like instruments of death. That's what Israel faced every time Sisera mobilized his forces. Judges chapter 4, verse 3 tells us the specific number. Sisera had 900 chariots fitted with iron. 900. Let that number sink in for a moment. This wasn't a small force. This wasn't a handful of elite units. This was an entire army built around the most advanced military technology of the ancient world. Chariots were already formidable in their regular form, but iron chariots were something else entirely. Most chariots of that era were made of wood, sometimes reinforced with bronze. They were fast and deadly, but they had weaknesses. They could be broken. They could be burned. But iron chariots, these were reinforced with iron plating, fitted with iron weapons, designed to be nearly indestructible on the battlefield. Each chariot carried a driver and at least one warrior, sometimes two. They were pulled by powerful horses trained for war, animals that wouldn't spook at the sound of battle or the smell of blood. When these chariots charged, they could break through infantry lines like a hammer through clay. The soldiers riding them could rain down arrows or spears on their enemies, while moving at speeds that made them almost impossible to target. But the real terror of the iron chariot wasn't just what it could do in battle. It was what it represented. Iron was expensive. Iron working required specialized knowledge and facilities. Having 900 iron chariots meant Sisera had access to resources, technology, and craftsmen that Israel simply didn't possess. It was a constant reminder that they were outmatched, outgunned, and overpowered. For Israel, facing Sisera's chariots in open battle was suicide. The valleys and plains where chariots operated best became death traps. Any Israelite force that tried to stand against them would be crushed under iron wheels and pierced by iron-tipped weapons. So what did Israel do? They avoided open conflict. They stayed in the hills where chariots couldn't go. They hid, they submitted, they endured. And that's exactly what Sisera wanted. He didn't need to hunt down every Israelite village. He didn't need to fight constant battles. The chariots did their job just by existing. Their presence kept Israel paralyzed, unable to resist, unable to unite, unable to rise up against their oppressors. The iron chariots were more than weapons. They were chains that bound an entire nation. Time can be a strange thing. A single day of suffering can feel like an eternity. But 20 years? 20 years of living under someone's boot? That doesn't just hurt. It changes you. It changes how you see yourself, how you see the world, how much hope you allow yourself to carry. Judges chapter 4, verse 3 tells us how long this lasted, because he had 900 chariots fitted with iron and had cruelly oppressed the Israelites for 20 years. 2 decades. An entire generation grew up knowing nothing but Canaanite oppression. Children who were born free became adults who had never known freedom. Young men who might have been warriors learned instead to bow their heads and pay tribute. Young women who should have felt safe in their own land learned to fear the sound of chariot wheels in the distance. The text uses a specific word, cruelly. This wasn't just political domination or economic taxation. This was brutal, harsh, oppressive treatment that made daily life a burden. Sisera and his forces didn't rule with justice, or even with indifferent authority. They ruled with cruelty, and cruelty has a purpose. It breaks the spirit. It makes people forget they were ever meant to be free. What did 20 years of cruel oppression look like? It meant fathers working their fields knowing that most of the harvest would go to Jabin's tax collectors. It meant mothers unable to protect their children from being conscripted for labor. It meant villages living in fear, never knowing when Sisera's soldiers might arrive demanding supplies, provisions, or worse. It meant the slow erosion of dignity, the daily humiliation of being powerless in your own land. The trade routes that should have brought prosperity to Israel were controlled by Sisera's forces. The roads that should have connected Israelite tribes to one another became dangerous paths where Canaanite soldiers demanded tolls and asked questions. The highlands where people sought safety became isolated pockets of survival rather than centers of community and worship. But perhaps the cruelest part of the oppression was what it did to their faith. For 20 years, God seemed silent. They had cried out to him when the oppression began, but the years stretched on with no answer, no deliverer, no Moses or Joshua rising up to lead them to freedom. The older generation told stories of what God had done in the past, but the younger generation looked around and saw only iron chariots and Canaanite soldiers. Where was God now? Had he forgotten them? Had he abandoned them completely? Some stopped believing. Some decided that maybe the Canaanite gods were stronger after all. Some just tried to survive day by day, keeping their heads down and hoping not to attract attention. The oppression didn't just steal their freedom, it stole their hope, their unity, their identity as God's chosen people. But suffering has a way of stripping away pretense. When you've lost everything else, when you've tried every other option, when you've exhausted every human solution, you finally become desperate enough to do the one thing you should have done first. You cry out to God. And Israel, after 20 long years, finally did. Rock bottom looks different for everyone, but you know you've reached it when pride stops mattering and you're willing to beg for help. Israel had been proud once. They had been the people who conquered Canaan, who defeated armies, who possessed the promised land. But 20 years of oppression had crushed that pride into dust. Now they were just desperate. The end of Judges chapter 4, verse 3 records what finally happened. The Israelites cried out to the Lord for help. These weren't casual prayers. This wasn't religious routine or empty ritual. This was the raw, agonized cry of a people who had nowhere else to turn. They had tried everything else. They had endured in silence. They had attempted small resistances. They had hoped things would somehow get better on their own. Nothing worked. The iron chariots remained. Sisera's cruelty continued. Jabin's power held firm. So they cried out. The Hebrew word suggests an intense cry, a shout, a desperate plea that comes from the very depths of the soul. It's the cry of a drowning person seeing a rescue boat in the distance. It's the cry of a parent whose child is in danger. It's the cry of someone who has finally admitted they cannot save themselves. Why did it take 20 years? Why didn't they cry out sooner? Perhaps pride had to die first. Perhaps they needed to exhaust every human solution before they were ready to trust God again. Perhaps God, in his wisdom, knew they needed to feel the full weight of life without him, before they would truly appreciate life with him. Whatever the reason, the cry finally came. And here's something beautiful about this moment. God was waiting for it. He hadn't abandoned them. He hadn't forgotten them. He had been waiting for them to remember him, to turn back to him, to acknowledge their need for him. The moment they cried out, his plan was already in motion. The deliverer was already chosen. The victory was already designed. But God's answer wouldn't look like anything they expected. They probably imagined a mighty warrior, another Ehud or Gideon, a man who could match Sisera's military prowess and somehow overcome those 900 iron chariots. What they got instead was something far more shocking, far more unlikely, and far more powerful than anything they could have imagined. What they got was a woman who held court under a palm tree, a prophet who heard directly from God, a judge who would lead Israel not through military might, but through faith. Her name was Deborah, and her story was about to begin. In a world dominated by warriors and kings, God chose someone completely unexpected to lead his people. Not a seasoned general, not a powerful tribal leader, not even a man. Judges chapter 4, verse 4 introduces us to the woman who would change everything. Now Deborah, a prophet, the wife of Lapidoth, was leading Israel at that time. 3 titles in one sentence: prophet, wife, leader. Each one significant, each one revealing something about who Deborah was and how God was working through her. She wasn't just filling one role, she was carrying the weight of an entire nation on her shoulders and doing it in a way that nobody had seen before. The word prophet means she spoke for God. She didn't just give good advice or make wise decisions based on experience. She heard directly from the Almighty and delivered his messages to the people. In a time when everyone else seemed to have forgotten God's voice, Deborah heard it clearly. In a generation that had turned to idols and false gods, she remained connected to the one true God. That connection made all the difference. She was also identified as the wife of Lapidoth. We don't know much about her husband. He's mentioned once here in this verse, and then never appears again in the story. Some people might see that as insignificant, but it actually tells us something important. Deborah wasn't defined by her husband. She wasn't leading Israel because of who she married. She had her own calling, her own relationship with God, her own authority that came directly from heaven. But the most remarkable title comes at the end. She was leading Israel. The Hebrew word used here is the same word used for the other judges, people like Ehud, Gideon, and Samson. She held the same position, the same authority, the same responsibility. She was a judge, the 4th one in the book, and the only woman among them. In a culture where leadership was almost exclusively male, God chose to work through Deborah. Why? Because God doesn't follow human expectations or cultural norms. He looks at the heart. He chooses people based on faithfulness, not gender. He calls those who will listen, who will obey, who will trust him completely. And in that dark time when Israel was crushed under Canaanite oppression, Deborah was the person who met those qualifications. Judges chapter 4 verse 5 gives us more detail about how she operated. She held court under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites went up to her to have their disputes decided. Notice the specificity. This wasn't vague spiritual leadership happening in secret. This was public, practical, daily work of governing God's people. She held court under a palm tree, not in a palace, not in a temple. Under a tree in the hill country, it was accessible, open, visible to anyone who needed her help. The tree even became known by her name, the Palm of Deborah, a living landmark that pointed people to where they could find justice and wisdom. The location between Ramah and Bethel was significant. These were well-known cities in the territory of Ephraim, central locations where people from different tribes could reach her. She wasn't isolated in one corner of Israel. She was positioned where she could serve the whole nation, where people from the north and south could come seeking her counsel, and come they did. The verse tells us the Israelites went up to her. They climbed the hills to reach her. They made the journey because they knew something the rest of the world had forgotten. God still spoke, and Deborah was his mouthpiece. She wasn't just another judge trying to manage chaos. She was a prophet delivering divine wisdom, and the people recognized that. There's something powerful about a leader people actually want to follow. Deborah didn't have to force her authority on anyone. She didn't need an army to back up her decisions or iron chariots to make people respect her. The Israelites came to her because they trusted her, because they knew her judgments were right, because when she spoke, they heard the voice of God. Day after day, people made their way to the palm of Deborah. Farmers with land disputes, neighbors who couldn't resolve their conflicts, families torn apart by disagreements, traders who had been cheated, everyone who needed justice, everyone who wanted truth, everyone who hoped for wisdom came climbing that hill to sit before the prophet judge and hear what God had to say about their situation. This was exactly what Israel needed in that moment. For 20 years, they had lived under Sisera's cruel oppression. The normal structures of society had been disrupted. Trust had broken down. People didn't know who to turn to when they had problems because the Canaanites controlled so much of their daily life. But Deborah provided something stable, something consistent, something that connected them back to God and to each other. Her judgments weren't random opinions. They weren't based on personal preference or political advantage. When people came before her with their disputes, she listened to God and delivered his verdict. That's what made her different from every other authority figure in Israel at that time. She wasn't working her own agenda. She was purely a channel for divine wisdom. Think about how rare that is. How often do leaders let their own desires, their own biases, their own need for power influence their decisions? But Deborah had surrendered all of that. Her ego wasn't involved. Her personal gain wasn't the goal. She simply heard from God and spoke what he told her to speak. That kind of pure leadership is like water in a desert. People will travel miles to find it. The fact that they went up to her also shows something about her reputation. In a time when many Israelites had turned away from God, when idol worship had infected the nation, when people had forgotten what it meant to follow the Lord, Deborah stood out. She was known. Her faithfulness was recognized. Her connection to God was obvious. You couldn't sit in her presence and doubt that she was the real thing. And they didn't just come once. The verse uses language that suggests this was ongoing, continuous. This was her daily work. Morning after morning, she sat under that palm tree and helped God's people navigate their lives according to his principles. She was rebuilding what 20 years of oppression had torn down. Community, justice, trust, faith. But Deborah's role was about to expand beyond settling disputes. God had a bigger plan, a more dangerous assignment, a mission that would require every ounce of faith she possessed. He was about to use this woman sitting under a palm tree to challenge the most powerful military force in the region. The time for judgment had passed. The time for war had come. Sometimes God's instructions are so clear, so specific, that there's no room for confusion or doubt. This was one of those moments. Deborah received a message from the Lord that would change the course of Israel's history, and she knew exactly what she needed to do with it. Judges chapter 4, verse 6 records what happened. She sent for Barak son of Abinoam from Kedesh in Naphtali, and said to him, "The Lord, the God of Israel, commands you, Go, take with you 10,000 men of Naphtali and Zebulun and lead them up to Mount Tabor. Notice she didn't ease into this conversation. She didn't start with pleasantries or build up to the main point. She led with a command from God himself. Barak was from Kadesh in Naphtali, up in the northern part of Israel, where Sisera's oppression was probably felt most heavily. He would have known firsthand what it meant to live under Canaanite cruelty, to see those iron chariots rolling through his homeland, to watch his people bow to foreign rulers. When Deborah sent for him, he came. When a prophet of God summons you, you don't ignore the invitation. But the message Deborah delivered must have seemed impossible. God was commanding Barak to gather an army, 10,000 men from the tribes of Naphtali and Zebulun, and lead them to Mount Tabor. This wasn't a suggestion or a possibility to consider. This was a direct order from the God of Israel. The word used here is strong, authoritative. This was the voice of the King of Heaven giving battle instructions to his people. 10,000 men sounds like a lot, until you remember what they would be facing. Sisera had 900 iron chariots, plus all the soldiers to operate them, plus additional infantry forces. And these Israelite men, they weren't professional soldiers. They were farmers, shepherds, craftsmen who would have to leave their homes and families to answer this call. They would be armed with simple weapons, no chariots, no advanced technology, just faith and obedience. Mount Tabor was the designated gathering point. This mountain rises dramatically from the Jezreel Valley, a natural fortress that offers strategic advantages. It was visible for miles, a clear landmark that men from both tribes could easily find. But more than that, it was high ground, the one place where iron chariots would be useless. If you're going to face an enemy with superior technology, you choose terrain that neutralizes their advantage. The specificity of God's plan is remarkable. Not just any tribes, but Naphtali and Zebulun. Not just any number, but exactly 10,000. Not just any location, but Mount Tabor. God wasn't being vague or leaving details to chance. He had already seen how this battle would unfold. He had already designed the strategy. All Barak had to do was trust and obey. But the command didn't stop there. Judges chapter 4, verse 7 continues with the rest of God's plan. I will lead Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his troops to the Kishon River, and give him into your hands. This is where the plan gets really interesting. God wasn't just telling Barak what to do. He was revealing what he himself would do. The Kishon River runs through the Jezreel Valley at the base of Mount Tabor. Normally, this valley would be perfect terrain for chariot warfare. Flat, open, ideal for the kind of mobile combat that made Sisera's forces so deadly. But God said he would lure Sisera there. He would draw the enemy into position. He would set the trap. Barak's job was simply to be in the right place at the right time and watch God work. And the outcome, already determined. Give him into your hands. Not might give him, not possibly give him, will give him. The battle was already won in heaven. Sisera's defeat was already decided. All that remained was for it to play out on earth. This is how God often works. He reveals his plan, gives specific instructions, and promises the outcome before the battle even begins. He doesn't leave his people guessing. He tells them what he's going to do, then asks them to trust him enough to step into the story he's writing. Promises matter, especially when they come from God. Barak was being asked to do something that looked suicidal from a human perspective. March 10,000 lightly armed men against the most feared military commander in Canaan. But he wasn't being asked to trust in his own strength or military genius. He was being asked to trust in a promise. The promise was clear and direct. God said, "I will give him into your hands." That little word "I" carries enormous weight. This wasn't going to be a victory won through superior tactics or better weapons or lucky circumstances. This was going to be God's victory, accomplished through God's power for God's glory. Barak and his men would be participants, but God would be the warrior. Think about what this promise meant. Sisera had terrorized Israel for 20 years. He had never been defeated. His iron chariots had crushed every resistance. His army had proven itself invincible time and time again. By every human calculation, facing him in battle was madness. But God was saying, "I will give him to you." Past tense, present certainty, future guaranteed. This is the kind of promise that either strengthens your faith or exposes your doubt. There's no middle ground. Either you believe God can do what he says he'll do, or you don't. Either you trust his word more than your circumstances, or you let fear make your decisions. Barak was standing at that crossroads, holding a promise in one hand and staring at 900 iron chariots in the other. The promise also revealed something about God's character. He doesn't send his people into battle without giving them what they need to win. He doesn't command obedience and then abandon them to figure it out on their own. When God gives an assignment, he also gives a promise. When he calls you into something dangerous, he guarantees the outcome. Your job is to obey. His job is to deliver. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Barak heard the command. He heard the promise. He knew this was the word of the Lord delivered through a proven prophet. And yet he hesitated. Fear is a strange thing. It can make you freeze when you should move. It can make you doubt what you know is true. It can make you add conditions to commands that shouldn't have any conditions at all. That's exactly what happened with Barak. Judges chapter 4 verse 8 records his response. Barak said to her, "If you go with me, I will go. But if you don't go with me, I won't go." Read that again. God himself had just commanded Barak to go to battle with a promise of victory. And Barak said, "I'll only go if you come with me, Deborah." This wasn't a request for advice. This wasn't asking for strategic counsel. This was making a condition. Barak was essentially saying, "I don't trust God's promise enough to obey unless you're physically present." He wanted the prophet to come along as some kind of security blanket, as if her presence would make God's word more reliable. On one level, you can understand his hesitation. He was being asked to lead men into battle against an enemy that had dominated Israel for 2 decades. He was being told to face 900 iron chariots with farmers carrying swords. From a human perspective, this looked impossible. Having Deborah there might provide some reassurance, some sense that God's presence was with them. But on another level, this was a failure of faith. God had already spoken. The command was clear. The promise was certain. What more did Barak need? If God says he'll give you victory, does it matter whether a prophet is standing next to you or sitting under a palm tree miles away? God's presence isn't limited by location. His power doesn't depend on having the right people in the right positions. Barak's condition revealed something about the spiritual state of Israel at that time. Even their military leader, the man chosen to lead the army, struggled to trust God completely. 20 years of oppression had done more than physical damage. It had weakened their faith, eroded their confidence in God's ability to save them. But notice that Barak didn't refuse entirely. He didn't say, "This is crazy, I won't do it." He didn't walk away from the command. He just added his own terms, his own safety requirements, his own comfort conditions. How often do we do the same thing? God calls us to something, and we respond with, yes, but only if. Deborah could have rebuked him. She could have told him to trust God and stop being afraid. She could have reminded him that the promise of victory came from the Almighty and needed no human supplement. But she didn't. Instead, her response was both gracious and sobering. Deborah agreed to go. She didn't scold Barak for his lack of faith. She didn't lecture him about trust. She simply said yes to his request. But she also told him the truth about what his condition would cost him. Judges chapter 4, verse 9 records her response. "Certainly I will go with you, but because of the course you are taking, the honor will not be yours. For the Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman." This wasn't said in anger. This was prophetic truth delivered with clarity. Deborah was showing Barak the consequence of his hesitation. The honor was going to be redirected. In ancient warfare, the commander who defeated the enemy leader received glory, recognition, a place in history. Barak should have been that commander. He should have been remembered as the man who ended Sisera's reign of terror, who freed Israel from oppression, who defeated the iron chariots. But because he demanded Deborah's presence instead of simply trusting God's word, that honor would go to someone else, and not just anyone else, a woman. In that culture, at that time, having the glory of victory go to a woman instead of a military commander was significant. It wasn't that women were less capable or less valuable, but warfare was considered a man's domain. For the final decisive blow against Sisera to be delivered by a woman would be both remarkable and humbling for Barak. Deborah was revealing what would happen, not as punishment, but as prophecy. This was God's plan unfolding. Barak's lack of complete faith didn't derail the mission. God would still give Israel victory, but it did change who would receive the recognition. The story would remember a woman's courage more than a commander's caution. But Deborah didn't just prophesy. She packed her bags. She agreed to go. The last part of verse 9 says, "So Deborah went with Barak to Kadesh." She left her place under the palm tree, left her role as judge settling disputes, and stepped into the role of prophet, accompanying an army to war. This was no small thing. She was putting herself in danger, traveling to the northern territories where Canaanite control was strongest, preparing to be present at a battle where 900 iron chariots would be involved. Kadesh was Barak's home territory in Naphtali. It was the gathering point where the 10,000 men would assemble. Deborah made the journey north with Barak, a visual demonstration that God's word was about to become reality. Her presence wasn't just emotional support for a fearful commander. It was prophetic confirmation that everything God had said was still in motion. Judges chapter 4, verse 10 tells us what happened when they arrived. There Barak summoned Zebulun and Naphtali, and 10,000 men went up under his command. Deborah also went up with him. The army assembled exactly as God had commanded. Men left their homes, their farms, their families, and answered the call. They climbed Mount Tabor, following a commander who was following a prophet who was following God. 10,000 men. No chariots, no iron weapons, just faith and obedience. They gathered on that mountain knowing what they faced, knowing about Sisera's reputation, knowing about the iron chariots waiting in the valley below. But they came anyway. Maybe it was because Deborah was there, the prophet whose words they trusted. Maybe it was because they were desperate enough to try anything. Maybe it was because 20 years of oppression had finally pushed them to the point where they'd rather die fighting than live booing. Whatever, their individual motivations, they were there. The army was assembled. The prophet was present. The mountain was occupied. Everything was in position exactly as God had designed it. Now there was just one more piece that needed to fall into place. Sisera needed to know they were there. Judges chapter 4, verse 11 gives us what seems like a random detail. Now Heber the Kenite had left the other Kenites, the descendants of Hobab, Moses' brother-in-law, and pitched his tent by the great tree in Zaanannim near Kadesh. This might seem like an interruption to the story, an odd piece of genealogical information dropped in at a strange moment. But nothing in Scripture is accidental. This detail was going to matter more than anyone could have imagined. The Kenites were nomadic people with historical connections to Israel through Moses. Heber had separated from his clan and set up camp near Kadesh, right in the area where all this activity was happening. He was there, watching, aware of what was developing, and soon his wife Jael would become the central figure in Deborah's prophecy coming true. Mount Tabor stood like a giant rising from the valley floor, its slopes now covered with 10,000 Israelite men who had answered the call. They weren't professional soldiers. They were ordinary men who had left their plows and their fishing nets and their workshops to stand against an enemy that had terrorized them for 20 years. They climbed that mountain knowing they might never come back down. The positioning was strategic. Mount Tabor rises about 1,800 feet above the surrounding plains, offering a commanding view of the Jezreel Valley below. From the summit you could see for miles in every direction. More importantly, the steep slopes made it nearly impossible for chariots to attack. Up here, Israel's greatest weakness, their lack of advanced military technology, didn't matter as much. Up here, they had the high ground. But being safe on a mountain wasn't the mission. God hadn't called them to hide on high ground and wait for the enemy to get bored and leave. He had called them to battle, and that meant eventually they would have to come down. They would have to descend into the valley where those iron chariots could operate. They would have to face Sisera in the open field, where his advantages became overwhelming. The men knew this. As they stood on that mountain, they could see the valley spread out below them. The Kishon River winding through the flatlands, the perfect terrain for chariot warfare. They knew what was coming. They knew what they were up against. Yet they stayed. They didn't desert. They didn't run back to their homes. They waited for the command, trusting that somehow God would do what he promised. Deborah was there among them. The prophet who had delivered God's word now stood with the army that would carry it out. Her presence was a constant reminder that this wasn't just another military campaign. This was a divine mission. God had spoken, and now his people were positioned to watch him work. Barak stood at the head of the army, the commander who had needed reassurance, but who had ultimately obeyed. Whatever doubts he carried, whatever fears troubled his mind, he had done what God asked. He had gathered the men. He had climbed the mountain. He was ready to lead them into battle when the moment came. That moment was about to arrive. Word of what was happening on Mount Tabor was spreading, and it wouldn't take long to reach the ears of the one man who needed to hear it most. Sisera was about to learn that Israel had assembled an army, and he was about to make the biggest mistake of his military career. Intelligence travels fast in wartime. Scouts and informants carried news across the region, and the gathering on Mount Tabor was too large to hide. 10,000 men don't assemble without someone noticing. Judges chapter 4, verse 12, records what happened when the report reached Sisera. When they told Sisera that Barak son of Abinoam had gone up to Mount Tabor. Just a simple notification, just the facts. Barak was on Mount Tabor with an army, but for Sisera, this was exactly what he'd been waiting for. For 20 years, he had controlled Israel through fear and superior firepower. The Israelites had learned to stay in the hills, to avoid confrontation, to submit rather than resist. And now, finally, they were foolish enough to gather in one place. This wasn't a threat. This was an opportunity. Sisera didn't hesitate. He didn't send a small force to investigate. He didn't try to negotiate or understand what was happening. He mobilized everything he had, because that's what you do when your enemy is foolish enough to give you a clear target. Judges chapter 4, verse 13, describes his response. Sisera summoned from Harosheth Hagoyim to the Kishon River all his men and his 900 chariots fitted with iron. This was total mobilization. Every chariot, every soldier, the entire military machine that had kept Israel subjugated for 2 decades was now rolling toward the valley below Mount Tabor. The ground shook with the sound of wheels, the air filled with dust from thousands of horses and hundreds of chariots moving as one massive force. This was power. This was might. This was everything that made Sisera invincible. From his perspective, this battle was already won. He had faced rebel groups before. He had crushed every attempt at resistance. The pattern was always the same. Gather some men, make some noise, get destroyed by iron chariots, go back to submission. This would be no different. He would ride into the Kishon Valley, deploy his chariots in the open terrain, and watch the Israelites break and run just like they always did. But Sisera didn't know something crucial. He didn't know that God himself had lured him there. Back in Judges chapter 4, verse 7, God had told Deborah, "I will lead Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his troops to the Kishon River, and give him into your hands." Sisera thought he was making a tactical decision. He thought he was taking advantage of an enemy's mistake. He didn't realize he was walking into a divine trap. This is how God often works with the enemies of his people. He uses their own confidence against them. He lets them think they're in control right up until the moment they discover they never were. Sisera was doing exactly what God knew he would do, moving his forces exactly where God wanted them, positioning himself for exactly the defeat God had already promised. The chariots rolled into the valley. The infantry took their positions. Sisera surveyed the situation from his command chariot, probably feeling that familiar surge of confidence that came from commanding such overwhelming force. Up on the mountain, he could see the Israelite army. They looked small from down here. They looked vulnerable. They looked like they were about to be slaughtered. What Sisera couldn't see was Deborah standing next to Barak, ready to deliver the word that would unleash God's power. What he couldn't see was that every chariot, every soldier, every weapon he had brought was about to become useless. What he couldn't see was that this wasn't going to be his victory. This was going to be his end. There's a moment before every battle when everything hangs in balance, when the decision to move forward determines everything that follows. The armies were in position. Sisera's chariots filled the valley below. Barak's men stood on the mountain above. The stage was set. Now someone had to give the order to begin. That someone was Deborah. Judges chapter 4, verse 14 records what she said. "Go, this is the day the Lord has given Sisera into your hands. Has not the Lord gone ahead of you?" This wasn't a suggestion. This wasn't encouragement. This was a prophetic declaration of reality. The victory was already accomplished in the heavenly realm. Now it just needed to happen on earth. Go! One word, clear, direct, urgent. No hesitation, no second guessing, no waiting for better conditions or more favorable circumstances. The time was now. The moment was here. Move. This is the day the Lord has given Sisera into your hands. Notice the verb tense. Not will give, has given. It's already done. The outcome is already determined. You're not fighting to win. You're fighting to claim what God has already granted you. And then the question, has not the Lord gone ahead of you? Before Barak took a single step down that mountain, before the first Israelite soldier engaged the first Canaanite warrior, before anyone drew a sword or threw a spear, God had already gone into battle. The Lord of hosts, the divine warrior, the one who needs no weapons or armies, had already moved ahead of them to fight on their behalf. This is what faith looks like in action. Not blind optimism, not wishful thinking, but trusting that when God says He'll do something, it's as good as done. Deborah spoke with absolute confidence because she had heard from God, and God doesn't lie. The last part of Judges chapter 4, verse 14 tells us what happened next. So Barak went down Mount Tabor, with 10,000 men following him. They descended. They left the safety of the high ground. They poured down the slopes toward the valley where 900 iron chariots waited for them. It must have looked like suicide. It must have felt like walking into death. But they went. Picture it. Thousands of men running down the mountain, their battle cries echoing across the valley, their weapons raised, their hearts pounding. They couldn't see what God was about to do. They couldn't see the divine intervention that was already in motion. They just obeyed. They just trusted. They just went. And then God moved. Judges chapter 4 verse 15 describes what happened. At Barak's advance, the Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots and army by the sword. That word, routed, is powerful. It means complete confusion, total chaos, overwhelming defeat. It means an organized army becoming a panicked mob. It means the impossible happening right before everyone's eyes. The Lord did this, not Barak's tactics, not the Israelites' weapons, not superior strategy or battlefield genius. God himself threw Sisera's army into confusion. He disrupted their coordination. He broke their ranks. He turned their strength into weakness and their confidence into terror. How did he do it? The Bible doesn't give us all the details in this verse, but it tells us who did it. The Lord. Sometimes that's all we need to know. Sometimes we don't need to understand the mechanics of the miracle. We just need to know that God showed up and everything changed. Sisera's army fell by the sword. The invincible force that had terrorized Israel for 20 years was being cut down. The chariots that were supposed to give them overwhelming advantage were failing. The technology that made them unstoppable was stopping. And Sisera, the great commander who had never been defeated, was watching his army fall apart around him. Sometimes the Bible gives us additional perspectives on the same event, showing us layers of reality we couldn't see from just one angle. Judges chapter 5 is the Song of Deborah, a poetic account of the battle that reveals what was happening in the spiritual realm while the physical battle raged below. And it shows us something remarkable about how God fought for Israel that day. Judges chapter 5, verses 12 and 13 call out to the participants, wake up, Deborah. Wake up, break out in song. Arise, Barak. Take captive your captives, son of Abinoam. The people who were left came down to the nobles. The people of the Lord came down to me against the mighty. This is the language of victory, the celebration of what God accomplished through unlikely people against impossible odds. But then the song describes something that happened during the battle, something that couldn't be seen with physical eyes, but was absolutely real. Judges chapter 5, verses 19 and 20 paint an incredible picture. Kings came, they fought, the kings of Canaan fought. At Tanach by the waters of Megiddo, They took no plunder of silver. From the heavens the stars fought. From their courses they fought against Sisera. The stars fought. Let that sink in for a moment. This wasn't just a battle between armies on Earth. This was cosmic warfare. The heavens themselves joined the fight against Sisera. The created order took sides. The forces of nature aligned with God's purpose and moved against his enemies. What does it mean that the stars fought from their courses? Some scholars think this refers to a storm, to lightning and thunder that disrupted the battle. Others think it speaks of divine intervention that we can't fully understand or explain. Whatever the exact mechanism, the message is clear. Heaven fought for Israel. The spiritual realm invaded the physical realm. God didn't just observe the battle from a distance. He actively participated, bringing forces into play that no human army could match. This explains why Sisera's army was routed so completely. They weren't just fighting Barak's 10,000 men. They were fighting against powers they couldn't see, forces they couldn't resist. A divine assault that came from above and shattered their ranks. You can't win a battle when the very heavens are against you. The song also mentions specific locations. Tanakh, the waters of Megiddo. These were real places in the Jezreel Valley, helping us understand exactly where this battle took place. But notice something interesting. They took no plunder of silver. Despite the battle happening near these important cities, despite fighting against an army that should have had significant wealth and resources, there was no plunder to take. Everything about this victory was unusual, supernatural, beyond normal patterns of warfare. Judges chapter 5, verse 21, continues the description. The river Kishon swept them away. The age-old river, the river Kishon. March on, my soul. Be strong. Now we're getting another layer of understanding about what happened. The stars fought, but so did the river. God turned the very geography of the battlefield against Sisera's forces. The Kishon River was about to play a starring role in Israel's victory. Under normal conditions, the Kishon was just a modest stream winding through the Jezreel Valley. During dry seasons, you could practically walk across it without getting your knees wet. It wasn't impressive. It wasn't dangerous. It was just there, a minor geographical feature that most people barely noticed. But God has a way of using the ordinary to accomplish the extraordinary. He has a way of turning the insignificant into the decisive factor. And on the day of Israel's battle against Sisera, the Kishon River became a weapon of divine judgment. Judges chapter 5, verse 21 declares, "The river Kishon swept them away, the age-old river, the river Kishon." Something happened to that river. Whether God sent a flash flood, whether rain fell upstream and sent a torrent through the valley, whether the ground simply couldn't handle the weight of 900 iron chariots and thousands of soldiers and became mud that trapped them. Whatever the specific mechanism, the result was clear. The river swept them away. Think about the irony. Sisera had positioned his forces near the Kishon River because the flat terrain there was perfect for chariot warfare. He chose the ground that gave him maximum advantage. But that same ground became his downfall. The river that should have been insignificant became the instrument of his destruction. Those iron chariots, the pride of Sisera's army, the weapons that had kept Israel subjugated for 20 years, became death traps. When the ground turns to mud, when water starts rising, a chariot isn't an advantage anymore. It's an anchor. It's a coffin. The very technology that made Sisera's army invincible became the thing that made them vulnerable. The charioteers couldn't maneuver. The horses couldn't get traction. The infantry couldn't move quickly through the flooding waters and mud. Everything that should have given Sisera victory was working against him. His army wasn't just being defeated, it was being swallowed up by forces of nature that answered to the God they had ignored. The song calls it the age-old river, acknowledging that the Kishon had been there long before this battle, long before Sisera, long before Israel. God had created that river centuries ago, knowing that one day he would use it to deliver his people. He had positioned it exactly where it needed to be, waiting for this moment, ready to become part of his rescue plan. Judges chapter 5, verse 22 adds another vivid detail. Then thundered the horses' hooves, galloping, galloping go his mighty steeds. This is the sound of panic. This is the sound of a desperate army trying to escape. The horses are galloping, but they're not charging into battle anymore. They're fleeing. They're trying to get away from the disaster unfolding around them. Can you hear it? The thunder of hundreds of horses running for their lives, the screams of men trapped in mud and water, the crash of chariots overturning, the chaos of an army that had controlled everything suddenly controlling nothing. The mighty steeds that had carried warriors into battle were now carrying them into death. And through it all, the Kishon River kept rising, kept flowing, kept sweeping away everything in its path. God had promised to give Sisera into Israel's hands, and he was keeping that promise in spectacular fashion. He wasn't just defeating the Canaanite army, he was demonstrating that no human power, no military technology, no impressive force could stand against him when he decided to act. The Israelite soldiers watched all this happen. They saw the confusion. They saw the flooding. They saw their impossible enemy being destroyed before their eyes. And they understood that they weren't winning this battle through their own strength. They were witnessing a miracle. They were seeing God fight for them exactly as he had promised. In the middle of catastrophe, instinct takes over. When everything falls apart, when your army collapses, when victory turns to disaster, survival becomes the only thought. For Sisera, the great commander who had terrorized Israel for 20 years, that moment had arrived. His entire worldview was crumbling around him, and he had one choice left: run. Judges chapter 4. Verse 15 concludes with a critical detail. Sisera got down from his chariot and fled on foot. This single sentence tells us everything about how completely the battle had turned. Sisera abandoned his chariot, the symbol of his power, the weapon that had made him invincible, the technology that had kept Israel crushed under his control. He left it behind because it had become useless, maybe even dangerous. A commander leaving his chariot was the ultimate admission of defeat. In ancient warfare, your chariot wasn't just transportation. It was your command post, your status symbol, your protection. A commander in his chariot was leading. A commander fleeing on foot was broken. Sisera had become just another desperate soldier trying to survive, no different from the panicked men around him, except that he had further to fall. He fled on foot. The man who had ridden in power now ran in terror. His iron chariot, the pride of his army, couldn't save him from the God of Israel. All his military genius, all his tactical experience, all his years of victory meant nothing when heaven decided to intervene. He was running for his life, and he knew that behind him, his entire army was being destroyed. Judges chapter 4. Verse 16 tells us what happened to the rest of his forces. Barak pursued the chariots and army as far as Harosheth Hagoyim, and all Sisera's troops fell by the sword. Not a man was left. Total annihilation. Complete destruction. Not a single survivor from the army that had oppressed Israel for 20 years. The chariots they had feared were now scattered wreckage. The soldiers they had dreaded were now dead. Barak pursued them all the way back to Harosheth Hagoyim. Sisera's base of operations. The battle didn't just happen at the Kishon River. It turned into a rout that covered miles. The Israelites chased down the fleeing Canaanites and destroyed them completely. Not one escaped. Not one survived to regroup. Not one lived to tell Jabin what had happened. This was the victory God had promised. Complete, decisive, overwhelming. But notice something important. While Barak was pursuing the army, while his men were finishing the battle, Sisera himself was gone. The commander had fled in a different direction, and he was still alive. Remember Deborah's prophecy back in Judges chapter 4, verse 9? She had told Barak, "The honor will not be yours, for the Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman." The battle was won, but the prophecy wasn't yet fulfilled. Sisera's death wouldn't come on the battlefield at the hands of Barak. It would come somewhere else, at the hands of someone unexpected, in a way that nobody could have predicted. Sisera ran. His legs carried him away from the battle, away from his destroyed army, away from the place where everything he had built was falling apart. He was looking for safety, for refuge, for somewhere to hide until he could figure out what to do next. He didn't know where he was going. He just knew he had to get away. And in his panic, in his desperate flight, he was heading straight toward the tent of someone who would become one of the most famous women in biblical history. He was running toward a woman who would complete what God had started. He was fleeing toward the very death that Deborah had prophesied. Desperation makes you trust people you shouldn't trust. When you're running for your life, when your world has collapsed, when you need help immediately, you stop asking careful questions. You just look for the nearest safe place and hope it actually is safe. That's exactly the situation Sisera found himself in. Judges chapter 4, verse 17 tells us where his flight took him. Sisera, meanwhile, fled on foot to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, because there was an alliance between Jabin king of Hazor and the family of Heber the Kenite. This wasn't random wandering. Sisera knew exactly where he was going. He had a reason to think this place would be safe. The Kenites were a nomadic people with a complicated history. They had connections to Israel going back to Moses, but they weren't Israelites themselves. They moved around, set up their tents in different locations, and generally tried to stay neutral in regional conflicts. Heber had separated from the main group of Kenites and settled his family near Kadesh, right in the area where all this warfare was happening. More importantly, there was an alliance between Heber's family and Jabin, Sisera's king. Treaties like this were serious business in the ancient world. They meant protection, mutual support, safe passage. If you were allied with someone, their camp was supposed to be a refuge for you. Sisera knew about this alliance. He was counting on it. He thought he could hide here until he figured out his next move. He arrived at the tent exhausted, terrified, probably injured or at least battered from his desperate flight. Everything he had commanded that morning was gone. His army was destroyed. His chariots were wrecked. His reputation was shattered. He had nothing left except the hope that this alliance would hold, that this tent would be sanctuary, that he could survive long enough to escape. But Sisera didn't know something crucial. He didn't know that political alliances don't always reflect personal convictions. He didn't know that Heber's wife might not share her husband's diplomatic arrangements. He didn't know that the woman whose tent he was approaching had already made a different choice about which side she was on. Her name was Jael. She was about to become the fulfillment of Deborah's prophecy. She was about to show that courage doesn't depend on armies or weapons or military training, and she was about to prove that God can use anyone absolutely anyone to accomplish his purposes, even a nomadic woman in a tent far from the battlefield. Sisera approached the tent thinking he was finding safety. He had no idea he was walking into the place where he would die. There's an art to making someone feel safe when you're planning to kill them. It requires control, deception, perfect acting. Jael demonstrated all of these qualities in the moments after Sisera arrived. She didn't panic. She didn't hesitate. She saw an opportunity and she took it. Judges chapter 4 verse 18 describes what happened. Jael went out to meet Sisera and said to him, "Come, my lord, come right in. Don't be afraid." So he entered her tent and she covered him with a blanket. Read those words carefully. She went out to meet him. She didn't wait for him to knock or call out. She took the initiative, greeting him before he could even ask for help. "Come, my lord." Respectful language, the kind of greeting you'd give to someone important, someone you're honoring. She called him Lord, acknowledging his status even though his army was destroyed and he was fleeing for his life. It was exactly what his ego needed to hear, exactly what would make him feel this was indeed safe territory. "Come right in. Don't be afraid." Those words were calculated. Sisera was afraid. How could he not be after watching his entire army die? But Jael spoke as if his fear was unnecessary, as if her tent was the safest place in the world for him. She was giving him permission to let his guard down, to relax, to stop running, and he did. He entered her tent. In ancient Near Eastern culture, this was significant. A man entering a woman's tent when her husband wasn't present was unusual, often inappropriate. But these were desperate circumstances, and Sisera was in no position to worry about social customs. He just needed somewhere to hide, and Jael was offering that place. She covered him with a blanket. This simple act communicated care, protection, hospitality. She was treating him like an honored guest who needed rest and recovery. The blanket would hide him if anyone came looking. It would keep him warm. It made him feel secured, sheltered, safe. Every action Jael took was designed to put Sisera at ease, to make him believe he had found exactly what he needed. And it worked. He trusted her. He let himself be vulnerable in her presence. He stopped being the alert, suspicious commander and became just a tired, desperate man, grateful for kindness. But Jael wasn't being kind. She was being strategic. Every word, every gesture, every moment of apparent hospitality was leading toward something else. She was gaining his trust so she could destroy him. She was creating the conditions that would allow her to do what needed to be done. Judges chapter 4 verse 19 continues the scene. "I'm thirsty," he said. "Please give me some water." She opened a skin of milk, gave him a drink, and covered him up again. Even in his exhaustion, even in his desperate situation, Sisera was giving orders. He asked for water, but Jael gave him something better, milk. Milk was a luxury, a sign of generous hospitality. It was richer than water, more satisfying, more special. By giving him milk instead of water, Jael was going above and beyond what he asked for. She was showing him extra care, extra consideration. She was deepening his sense that he was safe here, that she was on his side, that he could relax completely. And then she covered him up again. Twice now she had covered him with the blanket. Twice she had tucked him in like he was a child needing comfort. Each action reinforced the message. You're protected here. You're safe here. You can rest here. Sisera was falling for it completely. His guard was dropping. His fear was fading. The milk in his stomach and the warmth of the blanket were making him drowsy. He had one more instruction to give, one more order to ensure his safety, and then he could finally rest. Sisera's final words as a living man were commands. Even exhausted, even defeated, even hiding in a woman's tent, he was still trying to control the situation. Judges chapter 4 verse 20 records what he said. "Stand in the doorway of the tent. If someone comes by and asks you, 'Is anyone in there?' and say no." He was positioning her as his guard, his lookout, his first line of defense against anyone searching for him. He wanted her to lie for him, to protect him, to deny his presence if Israelite soldiers came looking. He was making her complicit in his survival, binding her to his escape plan with this simple instruction. But Sisera made a fatal error. He assumed Jael would obey him. He assumed her hospitality meant loyalty. He assumed the alliance between Heber and Jabin extended to this woman's personal choices. He was wrong about all of it, and his assumption cost him everything. The exhaustion caught up with him. The adrenaline that had kept him running for miles finally wore off. The milk made him drowsy. The blanket kept him warm. The sense of safety, false though it was, let him relax enough that sleep became irresistible. And Sisera, the great commander who had terrorized Israel for 20 years, fell asleep in Jael's tent. He never woke up. Judges chapter 4 verse 21 describes what happened next. But Jael, Heber's wife, picked up a tent peg and a hammer and went quietly to him while he lay fast asleep, exhausted. She drove the peg through his temple into the ground, and he died. One verse, one moment, one action that changed everything. Jael picked up her tools, not a sword, not a spear, not weapons of war. She used what she had, a tent peg and a hammer. These were ordinary items from her daily life. As a nomadic woman, she would have known how to set up and take down tents. She would have driven these pegs into the ground countless times, securing her family's shelter in different locations. The tools were familiar in her hands. She went quietly. No noise, no warning, no chance for him to wake up and defend himself. She approached while he lay fast asleep, exhausted. The text emphasizes his condition. He was deeply unconscious, worn out from battle and flight, completely vulnerable. And then she struck. She drove the peg through his temple into the ground. The temple is the side of the head, a vulnerable spot where the skull is thinner. The blow was precise, powerful, lethal. The tent peg went all the way through his head and into the ground beneath, pinning him there, ensuring there was no possibility of survival. He died, just like that. The man who had commanded 900 iron chariots. The man who had cruelly oppressed Israel for 20 years. The man who had seemed invincible, unstoppable, eternal in his power. He died at the hands of a woman with a tent peg in a quiet moment that lasted only seconds. This was the fulfillment of Deborah's prophecy. Back in Judges chapter 4 verse 9, she had told Barak, "The honor will not be yours, for the Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman." Not on the battlefield, not in glorious combat, not in a way that would give military glory to Israel's commander, but in a tent by a woman's hand with a common household tool. God had kept his promise in the most unexpected way possible. He had delivered the enemy into a woman's hands exactly as he said he would. Jael had become the instrument of divine judgment, the executioner of God's justice against a man who had brought so much suffering to God's people. The irony is almost poetic. Sisera had fled the battlefield where God fought with stars and rivers. He had escaped the swords of Barak's army. He had survived the destruction of his forces, but he couldn't escape the judgment God had decreed. He had run straight into the very death that was appointed for him, delivered by the least likely person in the least expected way. Heroes come in unexpected forms. Sometimes the most important victories aren't won by warriors on battlefields, but by ordinary people doing extraordinary things in quiet moments. Jael was about to be recognized for exactly that kind of courage. The Song of Deborah, recorded in Judges chapter 5, celebrates what Jael did with words that echo through history. Verse 24 declares, "Most blessed of women be Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, most blessed of tent-dwelling women." This isn't casual praise. This is profound recognition of someone who changed the course of history. Most blessed of women. Think about what that means. In all the women living in tents, in all the nomadic families scattered across the region, Jael stands out as the most blessed, not because of her wealth or status or family connections, but because of what she did in that crucial moment when Sisera came to her tent. The blessing isn't about her life becoming easier or more comfortable. Biblical blessing often means being chosen by God for a significant purpose, being used by Him to accomplish something that matters eternally. Jael was blessed because God worked through her, because she had the courage to act when action was needed, because she became part of His plan to deliver Israel. The song continues describing the encounter, giving us additional details about what happened. Judges chapter 5, verse 25 says, "He asked for water, and she gave him milk. In a bowl fit for nobles, she brought him curdled milk." The contrast is emphasized again. He asked for one thing. She gave him something better. She treated him like nobility, even as she planned his death. Then comes the description of the killing itself. Judges chapter 5, verses 26 and 27 paint the picture with poetic language. Her hand reached for the tent peg, her right hand for the workman's hammer. She struck Sisera, she crushed his head, she shattered and pierced his temple. At her feet he sank, he fell, there he lay. At her feet he sank, he fell, where he sank, there he fell, dead. The repetition emphasizes the completeness of his defeat. He sank, he fell, he lay dead. The mighty commander ended up at the feet of a woman, killed with a simple tool, stripped of all dignity and power. The poetry drives home how total his fall was, how absolute his destruction. This wasn't just about killing an enemy. This was about God using the weak to shame the strong, using the unlikely to accomplish what seemed impossible. Sisera represented everything that oppressed Israel: military might, advanced technology, cruel power. Jael represented everything that seemed powerless: a woman, a nomad, someone without armies or weapons or political authority. But God doesn't measure strength the way humans do. He sees courage where others see weakness. He finds his warriors in unexpected places, and he proved through Jael that obedience and faith matter more than physical strength or military training. The blessing pronounced over Jael wasn't just about honoring her. It was about teaching Israel, and everyone who would read this story for generations to come, that God can use anyone who's willing to act in faith. You don't need to be powerful or important or impressive. You just need to be available, obedient, and courageous enough to do what needs to be done when the moment arrives. Jael became a symbol of unexpected deliverance, a reminder that God's ways of working don't match human expectations. She earned her place in Israel's history not through military conquest or political maneuvering, but through one decisive act of courage that ended a tyrant's life and completed God's judgment against Israel's oppressor. Every story of victory has a corresponding story of loss. Every celebration of triumph means someone else is experiencing defeat. The Song of Deborah doesn't just celebrate Israel's victory, it also shows us the other side of the story with remarkable poetic power. Judges chapter 5, verse 28 introduces us to a woman who doesn't even get a name. Through the window peered Sisera's mother. Behind the lattice she cried out, "Why is his chariot so long in coming? Why is the clatter of his chariots delayed?" This is heartbreaking in its simplicity. A mother waiting for her son to come home from war, listening for the sound of his chariot, wondering why he's taking so long. She's at the window. She's been watching. She's been waiting. She knows her son went to battle against Israel, and she's expecting him to return victorious like he always has before. 20 years of successful campaigns, 20 years of victories, 20 years of her son coming home in triumph. Why would this time be different? She cries out her question. The Hebrew suggests anxiety, worry, a mother's instinct that something might be wrong mixed with confidence that it can't be. The clatter of chariots, that's what she's listening for. That familiar sound of iron wheels on stone. The sound that means her son is returning. But there's no sound. The road is silent. The expected arrival time has passed. She's starting to worry, starting to wonder, but she's not ready to believe the worst. Not yet. Not about her Sisera, the invincible commander, the son she's so proud of. Judges chapter 5, verse 29 tells us she's not alone. The wisest of her ladies answer her. Indeed, she keeps saying to herself. She has attendants, other noble women who are trying to comfort her, trying to explain the delay. But notice that last phrase, she keeps saying to herself. Whatever answers they give her, whatever reassurances they offer, she keeps repeating them to herself like a mantra, trying to convince herself that everything is fine. Verse 30 records what they're telling her. Are they not finding and dividing the spoils? A woman or two for each man, colourful garments as plunder for Sisera. Colourful garments embroidered, highly embroidered garments for my neck. All this as plunder? This is what they think explains the delay. He's busy collecting plunder. He's taking his time dividing up the rewards of victory. The details, they imagine, are terrible. Women captured as spoils of war, colourful garments stolen from the defeated, embroidered clothes for the mother's own neck, brought home as gifts from her victorious son. They're picturing rape and pillage and conquest, and they think these horrific things are good news, evidence that Sisera is winning. This is the mindset that had ruled for 20 years. This is what Sisera's mother expected her son to do. Bring home evidence of cruelty, trophies of oppression, spoils taken from people they had dominated. The casual way they discuss women being divided among the men shows how normalized this violence had become, how accepted these evil practices were in their culture. But they're wrong about everything. Sisera isn't dividing plunder. He isn't collecting spoils. He isn't bringing home embroidered garments or captured women. He's lying dead in a tent with a tent peg through his skull, and he's never coming home again. The mother keeps waiting. The attendants keep making excuses. They keep inventing reasons for the delay because none of them can imagine the truth. They can't conceive of Sisera being defeated. They can't picture the invincible army being destroyed. They can't fathom that everything they counted on, everything they trusted in, everything they built their lives around has come crashing down. This poetic scene serves multiple purposes. It humanizes the enemy, showing us that even oppressors have mothers who love them. It demonstrates the complete reversal that God accomplished, from confidence to confusion, from expectation to endless waiting, and it shows the justice of what happened. The mother who expected her son to bring home the spoils of cruelty will instead receive news of his death. The window watching, the anxious questions, the false reassurances, the waiting that will never end with the arrival they're hoping for. It's powerful poetry that drives home how completely God had defeated Israel's oppressor. Victory isn't just about winning a single battle. It's about what happens next, about whether the win leads to lasting change or just temporary relief. Israel's victory over Sisera could have been an isolated event, a brief moment of triumph in an ongoing cycle of oppression. But it wasn't. It was the beginning of something much bigger. Judges chapter 4, verse 22 shows us what happened when Barak arrived at Jael's tent. Just then Barak came by in pursuit of Sisera, and Jael went out to meet him. "Come," she said, "I will show you the man you're looking for." So he went in with her, and there lay Sisera with the tent peg through his temple, dead. Barak had been searching for his enemy, pursuing him across the battlefield, but he didn't get to be the one who killed him. He arrived to find Sisera already dead, killed by a woman, exactly as Deborah had prophesied. Imagine what that moment must have been like. Barak had led the army. He had charged down Mount Tabor. He had pursued the fleeing Canaanites. But the honor of actually killing the enemy commander went to someone else, someone who wasn't even a soldier. Deborah's words from Judges chapter 4, verse 9 had come true with perfect precision. But the story doesn't end with Sisera's death. Judges chapter 4, verse 23 expands our view. On that day God subdued Jabin king of Canaan before the Israelites. Notice who gets the credit. God, not Barak, not the Israelite army, not even Jael, though she played a crucial role. God subdued Jabin. This was his victory from beginning to end. Sisera was dead, but Jabin was still alive, still ruling from Hazor. The commander was gone, but the king remained. So what happened next? Judges chapter 4, verse 24 tells us, "And the hand of the Israelites pressed harder and harder against Jabin king of Canaan until they destroyed him." This wasn't immediate. It took time, but the momentum had shifted. Israel, which had been oppressed and crushed for 20 years, was now on the offensive. They pressed harder and harder. The language suggests increasing pressure, growing strength, mounting confidence. With each victory, with each successful battle, Israel became stronger, and Jabin became weaker. The tide had turned completely. The oppressor was becoming the oppressed, and eventually they destroyed him. Completely, totally. The king who had sold Israel into slavery was eliminated. This is what complete deliverance looks like. Not just defeating the army, but destroying the king. Not just winning a battle, but ending the entire system of oppression. God didn't just give Israel a momentary reprieve. He gave them total freedom from the enemy that had dominated them for 20 years. And then comes the most beautiful verse in the entire story. Judges chapter 5, verse 31, concludes the Song of Deborah with these words, "So may all your enemies perish, Lord, but may all who love you be like the sun when it rises in its strength." This is a prayer, a blessing, a declaration of what victory means in God's kingdom. May all God's enemies perish like Sisera perished. May every oppressor, every force of evil, every power that stands against God and his people be defeated just as completely as Jabin and Sisera were defeated. That's the fate that awaits everyone who opposes the Lord. But But for those who love God, something completely different. May they be like the sun rising in its strength, not weak or timid or defeated, not cowering or hiding or barely surviving, but like the sun, bright, powerful, unstoppable, giving light and life to everything around them. That's the promise for God's people. That's the future for those who trust Him. The last sentence of Judges chapter 5, verse 31 tells us the practical result of everything that happened. Then the land had peace for 40 years. 40 years. An entire generation grew up without knowing Canaanite oppression. Children were born, grew up, got married, had their own children, all in a time of peace that came because God had delivered His people. This is what God's deliverance accomplishes. Not just temporary relief, but lasting peace. Not just defeating one enemy, but establishing conditions where life can flourish. Not just stopping the oppression, but creating space for joy, growth, prosperity, and worship. The story that began with Israel crying out to God in their oppression ended with 40 years of peace. The cycle of rebellion and judgment was broken, at least for this generation. The people who had experienced God's miraculous deliverance remembered what He had done. They told their children. They sang Deborah's song. They worshipped the God who fights for His people. And at the center of it all were two women. Deborah, the prophet and judge, who heard God's voice and delivered His commands with courage and faith, and Jael, the tent-dwelling woman who acted with decisive courage when the moment demanded it. Together, they proved that God's kingdom doesn't operate by the world's rules. Power doesn't come from iron chariots or military might. Victory doesn't require impressive credentials or social status. God uses whoever is willing. He works through whoever trusts Him. And He delivers His people in ways that nobody expects, bringing honor to the humble and destruction to the proud, establishing justice where there was oppression, and creating peace where there was war. Their story reminds us that no enemy is too powerful when God decides to fight. No situation is too hopeless when heaven intervenes. No person is too ordinary to be used for something extraordinary. If this story impacted you, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss more biblical stories like you've never seen before. Share this video with someone who needs to remember that God specializes in impossible victories. And drop a comment telling us which part of Deborah's story spoke to you most. Until next time, remember, when God calls, the weak become strong, the fearful become brave, and the impossible becomes reality.